Welcome everyone to peer-reviewed and innovative carbon offsets. Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is brought to you by Second Nature in partnership with the Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative, Oberlin College, and Tomorrow's Climate Solutions. This webinar will be recorded and the recording and slides will be sent to all registrants in the days following the webinar. There will be a question and answer session at the end, and you can submit questions for the Q&A at any time using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Brett Passanella, Senior Manager of Innovative Services at Second Nature, and I will be joined today by Charles Adair from Duke and Tani Colbert-Sangri from Tomorrow's Climate Solutions, who's working with Oberlin College. So thank you all to our sponsors for making the work of Second Nature possible. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to very quickly reiterate that last year, Second Nature, as part of the 10-year anniversary of the ACU PCC, revised and relaunched the carbon commitment. So now we have 3 climate leadership commitments. If you're a new signatory signing today, you can choose to work on either resilience with the resilience commitment, carbon mitigation and carbon neutrality with the carbon commitment, or both in unison with the climate commitment. Existing ACU PCC signatories are now part of the carbon commitment, or if they choose to take on the work of resilience as well as their carbon neutrality commitments, they can become part of the climate commitment. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a very quick history of how we got here today and what our work with offsets has been and where we're taking it and how we came to launch these new guidelines. So the very first guidance around carbon offsets and offsetting was launched in 2008 as part of the ACU PCC. And that guidance was primarily focused on selecting high quality offsets, looking at the the evolving, very new nature of carbon markets at the time. How was a signatory to choose from all of the different offset products that were available at that time and figure out which ones would be high quality and which ones would help you meet carbon neutrality? So, and then as I mentioned, in 2015, we relaunched the climate leadership commitments. And as part of that relaunch, we gathered all of our guidance and existing documentation about how to implement the commitment and pulled it all together, updated it, and revised it, and launched that as the Sustainability and Climate Action Planning Guide on the Second Nature website. Also in 2015, we launched the Carbon Credit and Purchasing Program. So that is a program where campuses are developing offset projects on their campus, getting those projects third-party verified, and selling the carbon offsets on the market and using the funds generated through that sale to invest in things like green revolving funds or energy efficiency work on campus so that they can accelerate their carbon neutrality timeline by using that additional investment. We had a session at ASHE in 2015 on offsetting and a networking session where we talked to campuses to get an idea of what they were doing, if they wanted to participate in C2P2. Many campuses had let us know that they were pursuing things like local offset projects or were curious about them. So we had a networking session at ASHE to discuss all of those questions with signatories. And out of that session came the formation of a formal technical advisory group to Second Nature around the topic of offsetting to help us create a revision to the 2008 offset guidance, which we're getting ready to finalize and launch in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. So why did we feel that we needed to revise that 2008 guidance? The main reason was that, as I said, that guidance was primarily focused on trying to understand the complexities of the carbon offset market at that time. It was kind of a new market, very sort of wild west. You weren't always sure exactly what you were getting. And since that time, offset markets have very much stabilized. There's now a handful of really well-respected offset providers, and it's much easier to make decisions about what types of offsets to purchase. So we didn't need so much of a focus on that anymore. But many of our signatories were really expressing an interest in these sort of small-scale and local projects and many of which struggle with third-party verification. They wanted things that helped their local community, and we're trying to figure out ways to do those kinds of projects. There's been changes in how forest-based offsets work, and this is interesting to many of our campuses because they have on-campus forest land, and so previously they haven't counted that forest in their greenhouse gas inventories, but there's sort of new work about how you would do that, how you could get those forests accredited through third-party verification and things like that, and actually have them count towards your carbon reduction goals. There's been a lot of growth around on-campus renewables, so many more campuses are dealing with things like RECs and power purchase agreements and sales of renewable energy generation and offsets, and the whole complexity of the market around RECs and offsets has increased a lot for many campuses, which led to a lot of new financial complexities, but also a lot of new options for meeting your goals. So we felt that we had to address all of these new things that were happening in the past 10 years in the new guidance. Next slide, please. So how did we do that? Well, I mentioned that we had formed this technical advisory group, so we're really trying to draw on the the generative function of the Climate Leadership Network, really taking all of the learning that all of our signatory campuses have been doing over the last 10 years and bringing that together and making it available to more campuses so that everyone can learn together as a network. This group really formed at that networking session at ASHE last year. We have 25 or more representatives from different campuses around the Climate Leadership Network. And we started out with just some general brainstorming and discussion calls. What are people doing in the offset space? What are your questions? What are some things that you're struggling with? What are some things that are maybe out of date in our guidance that people are sort of have much more expertise in the offset field and are aware of these changes in the field that aren't reflected in our old guidance and things like that. And gradually those discussions focus down to be centered around revising that 2008 guidance document. And so we all together drafted a joint revision of that document. We put it out for a public comment period over the summer, and we had multiple sessions just in the last couple of weeks at ASHE this year to talk about them and get more feedback and generate more interest from additional campuses that may not have been involved in this process. Next slide, please. So the guidance in 2008 was really centered around these principles of high quality offsets, and there were 10 of them in 2008. And so this really sort of helped us define what an offset project is, what makes an offset project a viable option for reducing carbon emissions on your campus. And so there's sort of these 10 of these principles. It needs to be transparent, it needs to be real, measurable, verified, it can't be double counted. All that kind of stuff. And what we wound up doing, next slide please, was using these 10 principles as the basis of sort of thinking through this revision process. And did any of these need to be updated, removed, what definitions of each of these things might need to be updated or revised. And we wound up keeping the original 10 that we had started with, but adding 2 more principles that became very apparent that we needed to think more about. One was the idea of co-benefits. Since we are a network of higher educational institutions, we felt that the educational benefits of these projects is very important. And since there are many more types of projects available on the markets, and many campuses are doing these types of projects themselves and putting in an educational component, that is now a viable thing to think about and look for when you're going out to the market to purchase offsets. Is there an educational value? Or if you're developing an offset project yourself, how do we include our students in this process? How do we derive educational value either through formal curriculum or informal learning on our campus, or community outreach and learning within the community or our broader networks outside of our campus. And then the other thing unfortunately, over the 10 years experience dealing with offset markets, many campuses had encountered situations where it was not very clear who was the owner of the offsets. They had maybe partnered with a developer, and the developer said, sure, you can claim these offsets, we're not going to claim them, but the developer had held the actual ownership of the offsets or the RECs, and it became, it could become unclear for the campus who can actually claim them. So we encourage now for campuses to make sure that any offsets they purchase, the contracts that they, those contracts are enforceable, that they actually own any RECs or offsets associated with their project before they make any claims associated with greenhouse gas reductions related to those projects. Next slide, please. One of the new and sort of exciting things that we developed in the new guidance, really trying to think about the idea of local projects, smaller scale projects that can happen on campus and really get at that educational value, the co-benefits of offset projects. And really the focus of today's webinar is sort of this idea of peer-reviewed and innovative offsets. And so we're revising the commitments to allow for a certain portion of your offsets that you may purchase to help you get towards climate neutrality to not have to go through the third-party verification process. So 30% of your total campus emissions when you're thinking about just for your scope 3 emissions. So you can't use these types of offset projects to offset your on-campus use of natural gas or fleet or electricity purchases or anything like that. This is specifically for offsetting scope 3 emissions like your air travel or commuting emissions, things like that. So 30% of your total emissions can be offset through this mechanism of peer-reviewed or innovative offsets. And of that 30%, only 10% can come from the innovative offsets. And I think we'll explain why that is a little bit in more detail a little bit later. Next slide, please. So what are these peer-reviewed offsets? And Charles and Tanya will talk a lot more about this, but I just wanted to give a very quick sort of definition. In short, peer-reviewed projects are projects that most likely would pass through third-party verification without any kind of a process, but due to some factor, it doesn't make sense to do third-party verification. Perhaps the project is very, very small. Perhaps the project is has a very small budget, and the budget for the costs of third-party review would be much more than the project's budget itself. And so, doing third-party review would make it so that the project wasn't possible. So, these kinds of projects would be verified through the idea of a peer-to-peer network of other signatories or non-signatories who have expertise in higher education and offsets and would be able to review the protocols that were used to monitor and measure the project and basically do a peer review type of third-party verification rather than a commercial third-party verification process. So really the idea is that this provides more hands-on educational opportunities for students. They learn how offset protocols work. They learn how the verification process works. They learn about offset markets, can really foster small-scale projects, and it can help reduce the risk of developing a new protocol. So many campuses have been involved in not just generating new projects, but also generating new types of projects, new types of protocols. The C2P2 campuses had done this for energy efficiency. They were able to help create a new protocol for offsets that didn't exist before. So now that offset protocol is approved by an offset market. It's available for third-party verification. But that was a very long process with a lot of risk involved. And having this idea of being able to do sort of a third-party review of your offsets as the protocols are being developed really helps reduce that risk a little bit. On the other hand, innovative offsets are much more experimental. They may not be able to pass third-party verification, as they are now, and they're kind of a transition from this a new idea, a new type of project that's not yet moved down the path to verified, and it's kind of like a stepping stone to a more rigorous verification process. Next slide, please. So you can find the new climate guidance in the Sustainability and Planning and Climate Action Guide, which is located at that URL there at the top of the page, secondnature.org/climate guidance. And once you open the Climate Action Planning Guide, you'll find that it's divided into several sections. The carbon offset guidance is contained in the section called Building Blocks for Climate Action and Sustainability, and it's part of the Carbon Management and Greenhouse Gas Mitigation chapter. And here is a link to where you can go right into the carbon offset guidance, and this link will be live when you download the slides after the webinar. You'll be able to click on this link and go directly to the right chapter in the offset guidance. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to Charles Adair to take us through the next part of the presentation about peer-reviewed offsets.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. Thank you very much for having us on this webinar. My name is Charles Adair. I'm the Program Manager for the Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative. And just before I start, I definitely want to say thank you to Brett, not only for this webinar, but for also bringing the group together to update the guidance. I think it was definitely needed, and we would not have been able to do that without Brett. So thank you very much, Brett. What I want to do is back up a little bit and really tell the story about kind of offset project development to give a context for these two types of new offsets. So we're going to walk through first some project examples, kind of how projects are developed, the criteria we need to meet, etc. Then I'm going to try to frame the innovative offsets in that context, and then hand it over to Tani to talk about peer-reviewed offsets. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing about offsets, and part of the reason I enjoy working in this field, is really the flexibility that it allows, right? So any project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions outside of your boundaries could potentially be an offset project. And so you see here the variety of project examples that we have out there. And this is where it's really important to understand that there isn't a project example for every potential type of offset project. There are pathways that have not been explored yet, and it's really important for us to leverage our academic resources to pursue and create new pathways and new types of projects. In order to do that, we have to make sure that these projects follow the basic criteria and meet the minimum requirements, and hopefully go beyond that as well. So next slide, please. So just to go back and cover the basics, at the core of it, we want to make sure that offset projects follow these requirements here. And you've probably seen these in some way, shape, or form before. But in order for an offset project to really reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, we want to meet these requirements. And it takes not only it's not only about meeting these requirements, but also really showing that we're meeting these requirements, being transparent about the data collected, the processes used, etc. And so what ends up being very important, next slide please, is what we call the project protocol. So with every project that you do, generally what you're going to end up following is a project protocol for that project type. And this is a set of rules laid out that not only shows you the basic kind of project design to follow, but also the data you need to collect, the steps you need to take to make sure that you're proving that you're following those PAVER requirements, and a lot of additional information as well. The styles vary between different registries, but for the most part, if you're doing an offset project, you're going to be following a project protocol. Now, the challenge here is that you don't necessarily have a project protocol for every single project type out there. And so it becomes a challenge if you're trying to do a new type. If you're looking for a protocol and it does not exist, then you have this question of, okay, what do I do? What is that first step to move towards creating that new project type? So next slide, please. So the easiest way to understand this, we created this chart to just show your general project development pathway. So currently, if you're developing a project, you're going to select your project type, do your background research, etc., and then you're going to go out and identify a protocol that matches that project type. Now, when you're looking at this figure, right now, without innovative offsets, without peer-to-peer review offsets, you really have one option, which is to use an existing protocol or create a protocol that will be accepted as an existing protocol. But you're basically taking that top path. And once you've selected your protocol, you're going to go ahead and follow through, develop your project plan, register it, etc., as you can see here. And what we're trying to do is create another pathway to encourage new project types to be developed. So instead of using an existing protocol, how do you actually create your own protocol and go through this process without being penalized for being a first actor? Next slide, please. So Brett touched on these a little bit, and the two core challenges that we tend to run into with offset projects and project development. One is what I was just mentioning. You don't have that project type to look towards already, or a protocol does not exist. And then the second being that maybe you're doing a project based off of a current protocol, but your project is too small to really justify hiring a contractor to do third-party verification for you. And so we've been brainstorming these questions for a long time, and we realize that this isn't just a challenge, but it's an opportunity. Next slide, please. And so what it comes down to is not only how we address those challenges, but also how do we encourage innovation while addressing those challenges. And we realized from talking through this with the different schools while updating the guidance, there are a couple core principles here. You want to have flexibility. You want to be able to expand the options available. And a big part of that is going to be based on sharing best practices and connecting with others. So when we talk through all of that, we realize that what we need is really a pathway for developing new and innovative projects. And so what we've come up with is this innovative to peer review to third-party verification. So you can imagine, you're going to start out with an idea, and you want to test that idea. And it'll take a little bit for you to get all of the kinks worked out. So you're going to be in that innovative stage. And then once you've developed all the processes and the protocol, et cetera, you move up to the peer-reviewed stage, at which point you can use the set of rules you've created to make sure that you're transparent with everything you're doing, and to also share this with potentially another school who will review your work, because it's very obvious based on your protocol what you've needed to do to reach your goals. And so it'll make it very easy for that school to review and basically put a stamp of approval on. And then at the end of the day, if the project shows a lot of potential and expands and scales beyond that, then you can take it a step further and get it third-party verified, or get the protocol accepted, submitted and accepted to one of the current voluntary registries. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the innovative offset portion, and then go through some examples that we've encountered, which will explain, I hope, the reason that we felt that it was very important to have this offset type. So first of all, the PAVER requirements are core requirements that at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we meet them. But when you're designing a project, you're not always certain if you can meet them before you actually try the project. And so this is where, with the innovative projects, you have to try to meet most of the PAVER requirements right up front. But it's okay if you are unsure how to meet certain requirements. The point here is that you're transparent about it, and that you show how your project is going to eventually meet all of the requirements. So you still have to track and measure the offsets, and then because this is a different type of offset and you might not be meeting all those requirements right up front, it's very important for us to manage the risk associated with that, which is why we've put a cap on the amount that you can use for climate neutrality. So once again, as Brett mentioned, you can only use innovative project offsets for Scope 3, and they're limited to 10% of your total emissions annually. But the point here is to give the flexibility for institutions to really leverage their academic research and connect that back to the real world and be able to put it into play in the form of projects. And you want to do that in a way where you aren't penalizing first actors, right? You want to encourage people to test the waters, to try things out, to figure out what works and what doesn't, without necessarily penalizing. We actually want to give an incentive to do that and give them an incentive to then move into that peer-reviewed area as well. Next slide, please. So a couple of examples. I'm going to dig into these a little bit. So our energy efficiency program was an employee-based energy efficiency program. And so what we were doing is we were actually paying for audits for employees, walking them through the audit reports, and then encouraging them to do energy efficiency within their homes. And the idea was to remove barriers for them doing energy efficiency, and then to calculate the energy saved and the emission reductions associated with that energy saved. What we've run into and what we're still working through is in the context of energy saved, because we're in North Carolina and we're under a regulated utility, we have this scenario where if an employee uses a rebate or an incentive that the utility gives them, even if they're part of our program, the utility has the right to claim a certain portion of the efficiency, if not all of it, from the action they took. Right? So if there's an HVAC rebate, and even though our program is what pushed the person to actually go swap out their HVAC with a more efficient HVAC, if they go and use the rebate, they trigger this kind of double counting. Right? So the utility then calculates the energy saved as well and wants to claim that energy efficiency. So we've been very transparent about how we're trying to work through this. We eventually want to have conversations with the utility, but it's a very interesting scenario because, one, in North Carolina, emission reductions are generally separated from energy efficiency credits or renewable energy certificates. So there is precedent that you could split these two things up and sell them separately or claim them separately, which would then account for, then you would not be double counting. The other possibility here is that if Duke Energy is meeting their required energy efficiency under the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard here, then even if we are helping them to do more, if they aren't actually doing less because of our program, then once again, even though we might be double counting, it's not actually having a negative impact on emissions, right? We're actually still causing more emission reductions to occur. So it's a complicated scenario, but it's one that we felt, we understand it, we're trying to work through it, we're going to keep working at it and try to solve it. But in the meantime, we shouldn't just stop doing work because there's a question there, right? We need to continue doing work and try to use that work to answer that question. So similarly, urban forestry, this might be a little bit easier for you to relate to. With any type of forestry project, you have a permanence issue. And especially with urban forestry, if we're just planting trees, you have a question of after those trees have grown for 40, 50 years and they die, then what happens in terms of the offsets? And with our urban forestry program, we basically worked through all of the other requirements and created, working with Urban Offsets, a private company here, we've created a system in place to track the data, to be able to plant the trees, to be able to fund the trees. It's a really neat system. And the one question that we still have that's up in the air is the permanence question. And so our plan right now is to try to figure out how to address that long term. And we have a couple ideas. But in the meantime, what we're trying to do is essentially plant in areas that are protected, so either schools or easements, etc., so that those trees can reproduce naturally. That doesn't quite get at the problem, but it starts to. And once again, you can see the scenario here. What we said is, we have this challenge, we need to figure it out, but one of the best ways to figure it out is by actually getting some of these projects in the ground. So it doesn't make sense to not do anything just because we have this one piece to figure out. Instead, let's do the project, let's try to figure it out by actually getting the trees in the ground. So these challenges, you'll run into them for project development, you'll run into them across the board. And what we've found is, especially with universities, we think that universities are the best place to actually answer these questions. So that's why we've wanted to create this flexibility here and the pathway to then move beyond that. So with that, I'm going to let Tani take over, and Tani will be talking about moving from the innovative offsets to the peer-reviewed offsets and what the peer-reviewed offsets represent. So Tani, take it away.
All right, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Brett, and also thank you to Second Nature for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I'll be shifting gears a little bit and talking about peer review. And just to start off, there are some projects that could be developed starting as innovative, and then they would maybe graduate to peer review once they've fulfilled all of the PAVER requirements. But it's also possible that you develop a project that fulfills all the PAVER requirements initially, and then it would just go forward with the peer review process and wouldn't need to start at that innovative stage initially. So in terms of comparing the two types of offset projects and options that are now available, just like to take you through some of the differences here. So really a peer review offset, as I think Brett mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, is essentially a marketable offset that, for reasons of certain barrier, whether that's the cost of hiring a third-party certified verification consultant, or to help with the initial documentation, to avoid that cost, and so. For all other reasons, though, a peer-reviewed project could be marketed and would pass a third-party verification if you chose that route. So really, peer-reviewed is an attempt to make those projects more accessible to schools that are trying to develop them, and avoid some of the large expenses that can be associated with offset projects. So neither peer-reviewed nor innovative offsets would be marketable, but peer-reviewed offsets the goal for them is that they would be the same quality as any marketable offset that you might come across. And then with third-party verification, innovative offsets would not yet fulfill the verification. And both types of projects are going to have a really great impact reinforcing academic missions, and because of the locality of these projects to the campuses, they're going to impact those campuses and also create co-benefits for the surrounding communities as well. Would you go to the next slide, please? So both of these projects, as we've mentioned, the real goal here is to reduce the non-project associated costs of hiring consultants, developing internal capacity, and being able to accomplish that project documentation and then fulfill the accredited third-party verification. And the cost of that, just to put a number on it, can be anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 depending on the project type and the scale of the project. And that's whenever verification is required. So sometimes that can be an annual fee, or that can be every 2 years, every 5 years. But it's a large cost. And so we're trying to develop ways to get around that while maintaining the validity of the offsets that are created. Another goal that we have that Charles spoke to is we really want to incentivize schools that are moving in this direction and have set goals for themselves in terms of carbon neutrality and in terms of developing their own offset projects. We want there to be support for those institutions as they strive down this path. So whether that's developing a new way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or if that's bringing a project that has been proven elsewhere but doesn't exist in your community, those are the types of new projects that we're trying to incentivize with these additional options. And then also providing a level of risk assurance for those schools that are first actors. Next slide, please. So just want to take you through kind of the first thoughts that we've gathered, and this is still in development, but in terms of what the peer review process is going to look like once it's up and running. So this is the top image here is the same infographic that Charles spoke to of project development. I've just cut it in half here because the peer review process would only come into play after you've selected your project type and found a protocol that fits with that project type. So the first way the peer review process comes into play is you, as a project organizer, project developer, you would submit for initial approval to an advisory committee with your project description and the protocol that you're going to apply. And then, provided that they grant that approval to move forward, okay, my project is going to fulfill the requirements and it's going to be counted as part of the peer review program. The next step is to implement your project and then gather the documentation, set up the monitoring plan, and submit your documentation to the governing committee of the peer review network. And the documentation that you submit for a project we've got an initial website right now, offsetnetwork.org, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, but this is kind of a resource hub and could potentially be the place where we make project documentation available to the academic community for additional review. So after compiling your project documentation, then you pursue verification, locate a peer institution willing to take on the task of reviewing your project and building a verification report. And then the last step, that verification report would be submitted by the peer institution and live on the same sort of resource sharing platform as the project documentation and be available for additional public review or academic review. Next slide, please. So we've envisioned a few roles that a peer review committee would have, and initially to support this peer review process. So initially what's required is, we've been thinking and brainstorming what's needed to really structure and develop the peer review process and peer review and innovative projects. So the first role that this committee would play is to develop and structure that program. Also, we see this committee playing an advisory role. So if you're a new project organizer venturing into this space, there are actually a lot of people that we can connect you with who have maybe done a similar type of project, and we want to share those lessons learned as much as possible. So the committee would help forging those connections and also advising as needed. The third role would be to develop some criteria for institutions that are interested in becoming peer reviewers. So we want to make sure that to be a peer reviewer, you have capacity to provide high-level review of a carbon offset project. So you need to be familiar with project development or greenhouse gas accounting and carbon offsets in general. And the peer review committee would create those criteria that would allow an institution to become peer reviewer and then provide approval to that school. And then lastly, for any new protocols that are developed through the offset network, through schools that are looking to create a new project, or they couldn't find an existing protocol that matched their project type, the peer review committee would also provide a level of review for those protocols and approve their use through the peer review process. Next slide, please. So this is the homepage of the offsetnetwork.org website that we've created as the initial iteration of a hub around internally developed carbon offset projects within the academic community. Next slide, please. So the mission of the offset network is to facilitate and catalyze high integrity, unique offset projects, providing educational and research opportunities for students, faculty, and staff, and connecting peer institutions and aggregating best practices. Basically, the offset network is trying to gather the existing parties that have been making striding to expand options for carbon offsetting and developing their own projects, and bring those schools and universities together, forming community around this difficult task that we're all working towards. Next slide, please. So this is the projects page on the website, and we've got about 5 or 6 schools that have submitted projects that they've developed internally. If you think you have a project that might fit up on this page, if your school has developed it, then we would love to put your project up here, and we can send you a project info template that you can fill out, and we can get your project up on the site as well. And each of these images, each of these projects, you can click through them and read the description, and also find the contact info for the project organizer to get advice on urban forestry if you're considering a similar project for your own college campus. Next, please. On the Develop a Project tab, we've got that same infographic that you can refer to, and then a little bit further down, we've got a wealth of resources, links to existing registries that provide really good guidance if you're just starting out and thinking about developing a project, as well as the resources that Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative has gathered, and some other useful links for finding training materials if you're trying to develop your internal capacity to perform greenhouse gas accounting tasks. Next, please. So then we also have a Locate a Protocol tab, and each of these organizations on the bottom here, VCS, CDM, CAR, ACR, Gold Standard, you can click through all of them and it'll redirect you to that organization's Find a Protocol page. You can search for the project type that you're considering for a carbon offset project and see if there's an existing protocol that matches what the project you're moving forward with. And then it's not totally developed yet, but a little bit further down it talks through the process of, on this page, talks through the process of how you would go about developing your own protocol. But more to come on that as the committee works its magic. Next, please. All right, so moving forward, the Offset Network and Second Nature are going to be working closely to develop these resources and solidify the guidance on carbon offsetting, and really make this a more robust program in terms of structural support and resources available to schools venturing into the arena of developing their own carbon offset projects. Right now we're seeking nominations for members to be a part of the peer review committee. If you know anyone who has experience developing carbon offset projects, or is very familiar with carbon offsetting and greenhouse gas accounting. Those are the types of folks that we're looking to join this committee and really inform and structure the peer review process. And then what comes out of that committee and the structures that they decide upon, that will be added into the second nature guidance documents for fulfilling carbon neutrality. And then the last thing that second nature and the offset network are striving for, and this is a goal that we've got, is to link up with one of the existing greenhouse gas registries to provide an additional layer of professional backing and assurance that these projects represent real reductions of emissions, just to give ourselves a little bit more legitimacy. Next, please. All right, so that's all from me. Please, you can see Charles and my contact info. Feel free to reach out to either of us if any of this has sparked an idea in your head. We've got some time for questions now, but please feel free to reach out one-on-one to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tani and Charles. Great presentation. So we have some time for questions, and I want to remind everyone who is attending the webinar that you can submit additional questions still at this time with the questions function on your GoToWebinar control panel. So one of the questions we got when people completed the registration project, we got several different variations on this. Basically, the idea of when do you start thinking about offsets versus continuing with your on-campus abatement projects? And I can give kind of a quick answer to that, and then Charles and Tani, if you want to jump in with any additional thoughts that maybe I don't cover. First, I'd like to say that there's not really one answer. There's several different approaches to thinking about that question, and we kind of, in the very first section of the offset guidance that will be on the website, we kind of go through some of those different methods of thinking through this question. The standard answer, that sort of economics answer, is you should be looking at the marginal cost of abatement for each project that you do. So what's the cost per ton of CO2 reduced of that project? And when you hit that point where you've sort of picked all of the low-hanging fruit on campus, and that additional dollar that you want to invest in reducing carbon emissions could be better invested off campus through the purchase of offsets, you would reduce emissions more efficiently through purchasing off-campus reductions than on-campus reductions. That's sort of the standard answer. That is not always a satisfying answer, considering that some offsets can be purchased very cheaply. That thinking just in that sort of economic, what's the marginal cost, you might be jumping to offsets before you've really captured all of the cost savings you can on your own campus. So that's one method. And another method that some campuses have used is just the idea that climate change is such a threat, such a moral issue, that they feel that it's their moral obligation to be carbon neutral from the outset. So they just begin by offsetting everything, achieving carbon neutrality right away, and then gradually over time reducing their emissions so that each year that goes by they purchase fewer and fewer offsets. So those are sort of two extreme opposites, but there's always some mix of that campuses might want to consider. If there's a really great project in your community that has really strong community engagement value, it has really strong educational value, and it's within your means to develop it, you might want to develop that as soon as you can, and not really think about, well, should I do something on campus or off campus? I'm not sure. A project might be attractive enough to want to pursue it for its other, its educational co-benefits or other values, rather than considering what is more efficient cost-wise. Charles or Tani, do you have anything else?
Yeah, Brett, I think you outlined that really well. I think that I like to encourage people to not think of this as like a zero-sum game in the context of, do I do this or that? I think it makes a lot of sense to consider doing both right off the bat. And what you'll end up balancing is how you split your resources between the two based on everything Brett just mentioned. But I think you open a lot of doors by doing both of those things from the get-go. Because offsets are so flexible and because they leave the boundary of your school, you have this amazing opportunity to really connect with the community, to have a lot of impact, a lot of co-benefits, both from the community standpoint, but also a lot more flexibility from an academic standpoint. And so I think, when we're doing the stuff on campus, we still need to try to connect all the dots in terms of research, academic resources, opportunities for students, et cetera. But by including the offset projects right away, even if you're only doing a small offset project, it really gives you the flexibility and the option to expand that beyond your campus and to have an impact that then you can tie back very easily to, faculty, staff, and students, et cetera.
And the one thing that I would just add is that with carbon commitments in mind, you want to, if you're going to internally develop a project, it always takes longer than you expect it to. And so the sooner you can get that process going, and then a lot of projects that have to do with forestry or sequestering carbon in soil, they can often take a few years to ramp up to a level where they're having a full impact. So really it's advantageous to get the development process going early.
And another thing to think of is, you can be very flexible with offsetting. From year to year, you may purchase offsets or not. So it can be something that changes over time as you try to achieve carbon neutrality and fulfill the commitments. If you have an interim target coming up and you've fallen just a little bit short, perhaps you purchase some offsets to get over that hump and meet your midterm goal. But then over time, then you go back to the question of, well, am I going to be investing more on campus or off campus? What mix do I want to have to meet my goal? But offsets can be a short-term solution in many ways. And with programs like C2P2, if you're developing marketable offsets and having third-party verification, it can also be a vehicle for financing on-campus reduction. So some of our C2P2 schools, through the sale of offsets that they generated with their projects, were able to really get a big capital investment into their on-campus green revolving funds, and were able to cut 5 to 10 years off of their carbon neutrality target by having that greater investment in on-campus efficiency. So there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of different answers to that question. So I'm glad that so many people kind of asked that right off the bat when they were registering for the webinar. Here's a question pretty straightforward, so I think we can answer this one quickly. Would the peer review network, the offset network, be available to only signatories of the Second Nature climate leadership commitments, or would it be available for everyone?
Yeah, so this is Charles here. It's available for everyone. And that's why we actually created the network separate from Second Nature, but working very closely with Second Nature. We wanted to make sure that it would be a resource that not only would be available to everyone, but also be informed by everyone.
Right, and I think signatories will benefit from it very much, considering they have public commitments under the climate leadership commitments, but there are universities who are working in this area who are not signatories, and so we wouldn't want to exclude that work, especially if signatories can be learning from what other actors in higher ed are doing, regardless of whether they're signatories or not. Let's see. This was a good question too. So this goes to the idea of when we were designing the new guidelines around how many peer-reviewed and innovative offsets you could use. Why did we choose to go with the idea of a percentage rather than some kind of hard cap? And so that raises questions about if a school had 100 tons per year of emissions, they would be allowed 30 tons per year in innovative or peer-reviewed offsets. But if you only had a footprint of 10,000 tons, then you're only looking at 3,000 tons that you could offset through these other types of offsets. And I think the primary reason that we went with the percentage rather than the cap was when we were looking at the cap, I was able to sort of review what's the average footprint of all of our signatories, how much have they reduced over time that they've been a signatory, and sort of look through that. And when we were trying to come up with a cap, we realized if we came up with a reasonable cap for some of our larger signatories, that would allow them to do a project of a size that would make it worth doing the project, that cap would be so high that many of our very small signatories would be in a situation where they would be able to just completely offset their entire greenhouse gas inventory through these type of offsets. And we didn't think that would maintain the sort of rigor around the commitments that we wanted. We wanted people to always be, striving to achieve carbon neutrality in the most rigorous, verified way as possible, without, just sort of doing all, innovative projects that have very little verification for offsetting their entire footprint. Charles and Tani, did you have anything to add? I remember both of you are very active in that discussion within the group when we were trying to figure out the answer to that question.
Yeah, this is Charles again. I think another key point there is the importance of tying it to Scope 3. We had lots of discussions about how to make sure that this was, flexible, but also didn't exceed certain boundaries. And so one of the suggestions came up, and the entire group really liked the suggestion of limiting it to Scope 3, because from the context of impacting that internally at your institution, Scope 3 tends to be the most difficult. And so that's the scope that you most likely might have to offset anyway. And so that's where then Brett went back and looked at the percentages for Scope 3, and 30% seemed to be a common number for Scope 3 emissions for institutions. And so, you can imagine a scenario where we still want to encourage reduction within institutions, but then for these, air travel, staff commuting, et cetera, that are much, much harder to impact right away, then we wanted to have that flexibility.
Great.
Nothing to add.
Okay. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I think the last couple of questions we got were around just more examples of projects. So since we only have a couple minutes left, and I know you covered a few examples of types of projects, I think different, what are the different offset protocols that are out there available. I think maybe we can spend the last couple of minutes just discussing a couple more examples, maybe some projects that Charles, you've done personally, or that Tani, you've been involved in creating the protocols for?
Sure. So yeah, I've been working with Oberlin College to their first project that they've set up is an afforestation project, and it's about 8 or 9 acres of land that is being allowed to just naturally secede back to forest. So we're marking it off as this is a afforestation site, and over the next 10 to 15, 20 years, we're just minimal management to remove invasives and foster species diversity, but otherwise totally hands-off, just letting nature retake this land and regrow into forest. So for Oberlin College, such a small-scale afforestation project, there really wasn't an existing protocol out there that connected to the size and to the fact that the project was right next to Oberlin's campus, so students there are students actively using it as a research site through systems ecology class on campus, and that student research is actually being used to develop the project documentation and calculate the project impact. So with Oberlin College, I developed an afforestation protocol that fit the specific needs of this small-scale project, took into account the climate factors of Oberlin, Ohio, and really tried to translate the language that most of these carbon offset protocols are written in, which is very technical and difficult to understand, even if you know all the biological concepts that are at play, and translate that into something that staff, students, and faculty can understand. So the afforestation protocol is right now, it's been applied to this project, and this project is kind of pioneering the path forward through the peer review process and the protocol approval that's associated with that as well. So it's very much a pioneering project.
Great. Thanks so much. And we're actually out of time now, so I'd like to wrap things up and say thank you again to our two presenters, and thank you to all of the people who attended the webinar today. And the slides and the video should be available on Second Nature's website very soon. So thank you again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.